Parenting is hard enough. And if you add grief into the mix, it sometimes can feel overwhelming and impossible to navigate. Parenting alone is more than most people know ahead of time. When I had my two girls, I felt very confident going into parenting that this was going to be in a walk in the park. I don't know what all of these other people are complaining about, but parenting, no probs. I grew up with working at camps and working with children. Parenting, no problem. Then, when you have kids of your own, you discover that there is no manual, there is no amount of experience that can prepare you for those moments where you feel out of your depth. And you have these kiddos that are depending on you to navigate life with them. So then when you add in grief, which is often a topic that people feel like they don't have a vocabulary or depth of experience in, it is very reasonable to be like the proverbial deer in the headlights. So I'd like to welcome anybody watching this conversation to this round table. I've invited two beloved friends of mine who are deeply experienced and also have personal experience in navigating grief, to talk about parenting and grief. And so as we're having this conversation together, we're holding the topic a little bit loosely. We're filming this as a part of the grief gatherings uh, workshops that are happening all across Nova Scotia. And so people are joining us watching that, but we're also recording this for future use. So really the topic is parenting and grief, and we're going to hold it open. And when we use the term parent, we're also holding that kind of open too. Like it might be a caregiver, it might be a grandparent or an aunt or uncle or teacher. It's that relationship. You have a kiddo in your life that you're trying to figure out grief with. Also, when we talk about grief, we're primarily thinking about death of a person, but it could be navigating grief in many other ways as well, other forms of loss. But in general, that's what we're thinking of. And maybe it's that you're grieving as well. Maybe it's the kiddo grieving and you're trying to comfort them, like maybe they've lost a friend or a classmate. Maybe it's another parent, your co-parent that you're trying to navigate together. So we're going to have this conversation. And I've brought two beloved friends to the table who are so experienced in this. And I'll invite them to introduce themselves. First, my name is Sarah Scott, and I work with the Valley Hospice Foundation in grief care. And I also work at Valley Hospice as a spiritual care provider. And so I've invited my friends, Lyndon and Sue, and I'll throw it over to them to introduce themselves. But know this first, before they introduce themselves, that these two people are wholehearted, beautiful, kind, and really they show up with the whole of themselves for the work. This isn't just work for them, this is a personal calling. And so I'm so glad that they've been willing to share. And I'll invite each one of you to give a little intro about who you are and where you're coming from to the conversation. Lyndon, I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. So as Sarah said, my name is Lyndon Hardy, pronouns she, her, and I'm joining you today with a couple different hats on, but primarily a social worker by background and currently working at IWK Health as the bereavement coordinator. And so part of my role, while I live within the pediatric advanced care team, I serve all of IWK Health. And as part of my role, I am coordinating our bereavement services and delivering our bereavement services for anyone within sort of IWK Health that's navigating a death or a loss as part of their experience of care here. And so a big part of my work is supporting families as they're navigating grief together, whether that's through pregnancy and infant loss, through the death of a child, or if they're supporting children and youth grieving all different types of losses in their lives. And so that's where I'm coming with you today. And so a lot of my work is working with bereaved parents themselves. And then kind of on a personal note, I'll just share that I've been able to kind of apply some of this learning to my own life as just a few days before my first little one was born, we had a dear family friend die. And so in those early days, postpartum, navigating kind of that grief and loss combined with all those pieces in terms of being a new parent. And so while I may not speak specifically about that today, that's always a lens that I bring, especially as I'm coming to this work now as a parent myself. So thank you, Sarah. And over to you, Sue.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Smiley, and you can find me at suesmiley.com. I come to this work from 25 years as an educator at the community and college level, community rather, college and university level, and 30 years in private practice as a clinical therapist with a specialization in grief and loss. And although I've retired from the educational piece, my work now is more consulting with grieving organizations. So I design and deliver customized programming for organizations that are experiencing loss and people are grieving in their workplace, which makes for all kinds of different complex needs. Uh, I believe that children are always going to be our teachers when it comes to grief. And when I was doing individual counseling with children, at the end of a session with a child, I was always so tempted to lean in and ask them, how much do I owe you? In a perfect world, that's how it would exist. My personal experience is my first husband died when I was 27 and he was 32 and our daughter was 2. So I had first hand experience with a grieving child who taught me so much about surviving loss. And I've applied a lot of those learnings combined with my educational and work experience. So I love being with parents. I love being with children. And again, if we can reverse the order and see children as the teachers, we can learn so much about their internal world and how they're processing grief.
Already, I find that very insightful, Sue, and we've just done the introductions. Absolutely, I totally agree. So, a lot of the times, like from my context in hospice, I'm meeting parents sort of as initially they're experiencing grief, and and then there's a real natural sort of brain response. Like whenever we have these stressful situations, we talk about the amygdala part of the brain of that freeze and flight, and those responses. I find a lot of parents freeze when they come to grief, and they turn to me and they say, um, "What do I tell my kids?" Like they themselves almost become statues and they've experienced such grief because they kind of feel like they have to, pull themselves together once the kids come into the room. Uh, and I see that firsthand. So, Lyndon, this first part I'll ask you. So, when you're meeting parents, is there anything that you could share about like insights or suggestions when parents themselves or caregivers are concerned about expressing grief with their kids or around like those initial stages when they're experiencing such grief themselves?
Yeah, I would say this is probably one of the most kind of frequently asked questions from bereaved parents is just figuring out how to navigate their own emotions within grief while parenting, while actively parenting. And there's just, as you kind of alluded to, Sarah, there's just this sense of this deep desire to protect children, of course, from any sort of difficulty or suffering or distress. And so many parents, caregivers, trusted adults, there is this hesitation or this worry about expressing grief authentically, especially the expressive, so kind of the more emotive side of things in the presence of children and youth, because there's this worry, there's this fear of maybe losing control of emotions once you let a little bit out, maybe scaring or alarming children with maybe the potential intensity of your grief emotions, not being able to answer questions that expressing those emotions might then inspire from children and youth. And so there's all these layers of worry and apprehension and anxiety. And so I find when I do kind of feel that question from bereaved parents or any sort of caregiver, it's really, again, of course, you want to validate that emotion and that fear and that sense of protection because it comes from such a deep, caring place, while also wanting to really create space and recognize that their emotions need to be expressed in a safe place. And so, tucking those emotions in or hiding them for the sake of someone else, completely valiant, but not necessarily helpful or for the long run or for long term or for the family unit as a whole. So I think about, or I'll kind of reassure parents and caregivers by talking about the importance of modeling grief and modeling emotional expression, of demonstrating that it's okay to have these feelings, that there's a variety of feelings that come up with grief, and how that will then communicate to children and youth that whatever they're feeling is okay and welcome. I think it also reminds children and youth to recognize that if they've experienced, so say if they were the ones that were no longer there anymore, if they were the ones that died or something happened to them, that their people would grieve them. And so they can see in real time, oh, we love the people in our lives, and this is one of the ways that we might respond to them not being with us anymore. And that also, that relationship and that vulnerability can be really scary, to step into that space. But that tenderness and those points of connection, once you get through the fear side of things, you might come out of it feeling quite a bit more connected as a family, because everyone's got an understanding of where everyone is at, in terms of grief. And you've just opened the door to say, whatever we're all feeling is okay. We're going to be here for each other. I feel this, you feel this, and we're going to, figure out how to navigate this as a unit. Yeah.
That's so valuable, because I know one of my earliest experiences with grief, like many kids, is the death of a grandparent, and I would have been in elementary school. And I remember the sadness, and I remember, those sort of the quiet times. But I think the greatest teaching moment in that experience was, we're at the wake, which, so there's many things here that we often even don't have anymore for children. I was invited to be a part of that visitation. I was a part of that wake. So like the body was present in the room, which again is very helpful for kids. So I was able to sort of see how my adults in the room were responding in the situation. But then, this was a family gathering, and they hadn't seen one another. So as the time progressed, there was a lot of laughter. And I was looking over to my mom and my aunties that were all together, and they started like legs crossed level of laughter. And I remember as a young person thinking, this is not appropriate. But that early example was modeling to me that grief is not just sadness. Grief is also like this memory sharing, this feeling of being together. This woman who died was the glue that brought all of these people together. And so it was like that, seeing my parents almost not ignore me, but like allow me to be in the presence of their natural feelings. I was able to see a range of emotions in that state. So being welcomed into the whole process.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions around grief and children is that children need to be protected from it. And I think, if a community is celebrating something, children are not excluded. And I oftentimes, with parents, the hardest thing for them to do is to hold space for a sad child and not attempt to cheer them up and not attempt to guide their emotions in any way. I mentioned that my daughter was 2 when her dad died, and when she returned to daycare, uh, her teacher told me that she had spoken to the other kids about where my daughter had been and what had happened. And I thought that was fantastic, because nobody really wants to take on this topic, or at least they weren't at that time. So when I went to pick her up, the most darling little redheaded boy came up to me and told me that he was available to look for Haley's dad. And I was quite confused by his comment. And he said that the teacher said that Haley had lost her dad. And again, it's so important to use clear, direct language with children. They don't need to have it softened. Words like dead and died are really, really helpful. And I mentioned too about, children being our teachers. And they, by virtue of their age, they haven't been on the planet as long as adults. So they don't have the emotional baggage. They don't have the scripts. They don't have the, you should say this, you shouldn't say that. So they're so free in being able to respond. The children that I've worked for and with over the years, not once in 30 years has a child said to me, I wish I hadn't gone to the funeral. And many children have said, I wish I had been asked if I wanted to go, because you can't unring a bell. There will be other opportunities as part of our human experience. But yeah, they regretted that they had not been invited to enter into that. The other last thing I wanted to add was I was working with a mother and a young daughter, and the dad had died. And the mother started crying during our session. And her daughter said, Mom, why are you crying? And her mom said, I'm not crying. And her daughter looked at me and I looked at her, and I said to the little girl, I said, well, your mom's face is leaking. We can clearly see that she's crying. And so I said to her, Mom, why are you denying that you're crying? And she said, because I don't want to upset my daughter. And her daughter said, well, I can hear you cry at night when you're in your bedroom and I'm in my bedroom. And the mom was like surprised. She thought she totally, was concealing this from her daughter. So I looked at the little one and I said, what do you think you and your mom could do? And she said, well, we have a big couch in our upstairs hall. Maybe we could meet there and cry together. Perfect. I didn't fix that. I didn't suggest that. And so they did that and they shared their grief. And one person amongst many whose work I follow is Gabor Mate. And he said children are not traumatized by loss. They're traumatized by being left alone in it. And so, yeah, they were together in it. And that was hugely healing for both of them.
That touches on too, like by sharing your grief with a child, you're also giving them opportunity to include them in the act of comfort too.
Yes.
So you're showing us, okay, not only do we grieve together, but we can comfort each other. And there's different ways that we comfort each other, or different ways that we care for each other. So I think of your example, Sarah, with the funeral, of being part of like, oh, this is how people maybe comfort each other through laughter, and even that piece of being maybe on the couch to cry. And you're given the opportunity to build those essential skills too, about how to be in community with other people in your grief. What a powerful thing to bring forward as you grow up. Yeah.
Even as I'm writing down here, like I'm writing down, talk to me, be with me.
Yes.
And Lyndon, I like that example too. Like, allow me to be with you, allow me to talk to you, and sort of like interview you about how you're feeling. Allow me to. It is so powerful when children comfort us. And little babies have such a capacity. Like they understand.
Yes.
They will
Yes.
hold
No,
your face and like pat you.
absolutely.
And that would generate that empathy and that
Yes.
connection and that bond. So talk to me, be with me, on both levels. And I think we could talk a little bit more about those communication, because I'd like to flesh that out a little bit more. And then also the funerals and rituals. I think I'd like to flesh that a little more. So maybe on communication, is there more that we can flesh out there? For example, so one of the projects that we work on in the foundation is the Grief Library, which is a provincially available library that's no cost to the borrower. And we have about 400 different books that we are lending right now all across the province. You can do book by mail or come by our location, and all the information's on our foundation website. So there's 400 books for kids, adults, teens, the whole gamut. But we didn't put every book on grief in that library. Terry Melton is our librarian and comes from the library science background. Curation is a part of that, because there were a couple of books that we looked there. There were more than a couple books that we looked at for children, and I was like, "Good glory! This is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Like, this is just beyond." This one book used all this strange imagery, using it like it was using they there's often the storybooks use animals like to compare, but this was one step beyond. This was talking about like a grandmother mouse who was preparing to go to the moon, that was made of cheese, and she was getting her belongings together, and her people would miss them, but they would know that she was always there. Like, so that idea of veiled language, allegory, uh,
Euphemisms.
euphemisms, it was all in this one perfect little book, and I was just like, no. So can you talk more? I'll throw it out to either one of you about the importance of clarity in language and age-specific terminology. One book that I loved in our library is the book Lifetimes for preschool kids, young children. It's the one I read to my children, not because they were going through loss, because it's a good book to read. And that idea that everything has a lifetime. This is normal. Sometimes this happens, but everything has, and I was sort of looking through with death and using those clear languages. So let me throw that out there to either one of you. Communication, the importance of clarity, and maybe it's something about like that age appropriateness of language.
What you just said reminded me, Sarah, the very best time to talk about loss is when there hasn't been one. So oftentimes people wait. They wait till something happens at the school, they wait till something happens in the family, and no one can process because emotion is really high during that time. And here's the thing about kids, they love to talk about things that appear to be taboo. So if an adult shows any reluctance to talk about death or sex, it really tweaks their interest because they're like, okay, this is good stuff because no one wants to talk to me about it. So when is the best time to talk to children about loss and death? Anytime. Nature is full of that. From, don't replace the hamster, have a funeral for the hamster, pick out music, invite people, show kids how we celebrate a being's life and
Do
how
you
much we're
know
going to miss
there's a
them.
book we have, Sue, in the library called I can't remember what it's called, but something about like a dead bird, and it's all these
Mhm.
little school children. They're coming at Lyndon. You know the one I mean? And
Is
there's
maybe
just this
Death is
dead.
Stupid? Yeah.
What is it called?
Maybe Death is Stupid? Is it Death is Stupid?
Yeah. It
Yeah,
was,
okay.
and it's using that idea exactly, and you're right, Sue. Like kids are drawn into it, and so that moment of peace, and having the conversations with whether it's with grandparents or with parents or
Mhm.
with teachers or classroom of just that observation of.
Because I've worked with adults who've been denied the opportunity to try on loss, and then when it hits them, as it will everyone at our time and place in the universe, they're ill prepared because they have no skin for it. They don't know they can survive it. They don't have the strategies because they have been so overprotected to not experience it along the way. The other thing about kids is they're so much wiser than we all think. They have this third ear under their hair that picks up whispering and spelling of words. I had a child who was protecting his mother. The mother thought she was protecting him by saying the dad had died in a car accident, when really he had died by suicide. And the child told me in a session that the dad had died by suicide, but please don't tell my mom because she doesn't know. So all along, the child knew. And so, again, we want to be appropriate in how we share with children, especially, developmentally. So my daughter was 2 when her dad died. For a week after he died, she would ask me, are we going to the hospital today? And every day I would say, no, darling, daddy died. Daddy's not there. We were driving one day in the car. She's about 3 or 4. We weren't talking about death. And right out of the blue, she's looking out the window. She says, hey, is my dad still dead? Yeah, still dead. So they don't wait for this beautiful hallmark moment to interject. One time she was sitting on the toilet reading a book, as was her custom. And she said, do you think my dad can see me right now? And I said, oh, I don't know. What do you think? Because had it been my belief that I thought it was comforting that her dad could see her at all times, maybe she would grow up to be a sexually dysfunctional adult because she believed her dad could see her. And I don't know. That's the other thing. Parents, just say, I don't know. What do you think? And that's what I love about this work because no one has a monopoly on the truth. And I will support any family belief system, etc. It's not my role to challenge that. And I'm intrigued by what kids think. Last little bit I wanted to share, and Lyndon, please jump in because I could really talk about this for many, many days, is I had this little one tell me that this was not the first time she'd been to this planet. And so I said to her, because during the session, I said to her, how did you get to be so wise? She's 8 years old. And she said to me, well, it's not my first time here. And I said, you mean counseling? She said, no, the planet. So I said, well, how many times have you been here? And she said, I think probably 3. And I said, can you tell me about those times? And she said, well, I don't remember them, but I know you get to keep your wisdom. Mind blown. So her dad comes to pick her up, and I said, do you talk to your daughter about, different world religions and reincarnation and Hindu, back on the wheel of life kind of thing? And he was like, no. So she had come to this all on her own. And I just thought it was so brilliant.
I
And
always
and
love the expression, I wonder,
yeah,
even it, I like that one myself because it made me feel not so dumb to say, like, I don't know, but like,
yeah.
I wonder about that too. I
So
wonder.
so my daughter said to me on the toilet, well, I think he can see me when I want him to see me, and when I don't want him to see me, I think he can. And I said, cool. And then she said, what's to eat? So that's how it is with kids.
Yeah, their imaginations, right? Like there's
Yes.
just such this, there's so much space, there is so much room for it. And so that can be so beautiful, and create such these magical conversations. And it also, as you kind of spoke to earlier, Sue, it also just shows how important it is to use that clear, honest language, because as you share with that first example in terms of the daycare, otherwise kids will jump to their own conclusions and they'll fill in their
Mm,
own gaps. So if you don't give them that clear, comprehensive information, it doesn't need to be super detailed, but it's
mm,
something that they're able to understand in their current framework. Otherwise, they're going to fill in the blanks. They're going to think, oh,
mm.
if they've lost their dad, I can go find them. When I've
Yeah.
lost something, I go and look for it. So that's why it's really important to kind of use that clear language, use, like you said, Sue, language of death and dying, explain what being dead means. So it
Mhm.
means that your body has stopped working. It no longer feels hunger, pain, temperature. That includes the head, and it's not going to start working again. So there are all these tools out there around how to answer those questions. And like you spoke to, Sue, preparing, because you're going to get those questions in the car when you're driving.
Mhm.
You're going to get them right before bedtime. You're going to get them when you're cooking dinner. It's always going to be a point where you're maybe a little more vulnerable because you're doing something else and your child is looking for connection and they might feel like, oh, I have their attention, their focus. This is a great time to ask a question and
Mhm.
I
maybe take
wonder,
my
like,
parent off guard.
see,
Yeah.
like hearing the two of you, like I wonder if a strategy for parents or caregivers might be to interview their kids. So if they're in a situation already where like a grief event has happened, maybe that's a one way into the conversation to say, "What do you think?" Or what? Tell me
Mhm.
about that. We're going to a funeral. What do you know about funerals? Like or just rather than going into lecture mode, which most kids at every age turn off very quickly, go into that exploratory mode. It'd be like, we're going to the hospital because, your grandfather has died. I wonder what we'll see there. Like, and they might, that might be helpful for you as a parent to get a sense of where are the gaps of knowledge that my kid has, that might need to be sort of addressed as you
Anytime you can position yourself as student and the child as teacher, they're much more likely to share. So I was invited into a grade 4 classroom where one of the students, her sister had died. And the kids, because they didn't know what to say to her, which is a common thing that adults say as well, I didn't know what to say, they started avoiding her. And she felt very isolated. So the parents wanted me to go into the school. So I gained the permission of the school board, the teacher, the principal. The teacher said to me, the kids will not talk to you about this. Just be prepared. It's going to be a lot of quiet. And I'm like, yeah, of course. So the principal was in the room, the teacher was in the room. And I told the kids, I introduced myself and I said, I'm writing an article about grief and I'm here to learn from you all. And they never stopped talking. And the principal was surprised. I wasn't, because of lived experience of positioning myself as student and they as teacher. And they ended up making really wonderful sympathy cards for the student that don't exist. You can't buy these cards in a card store, and they were very specific to this little girl. And we did some art therapy exercises, and at the end, all based on their ideas. I was just like, wow, that would be cool. And I had all these art supplies with me. So they figured it out. They taught me. I'm reminded of the movie Inside Out. So if people haven't seen it, it's all about feelings and emotions. Inside Out 2 involved new characters, and one of the characters was anxiety. So I said to my 7-year-old granddaughter, B, wouldn't it be great if they had a grief character? Because they've got joy, they've got anger, they've got disappointment, they've got ennui, all these different emotions. And B looked at me and she said, Mimi, which is my grandmother name. She said, Mimi, grief is all the emotions. And I just kind of slunk away like 30 years. It didn't occur to me so I was like, thank you, B. Yes, of course you're right. So I'm constantly the student, constantly, and I like it that way.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm wondering, for the two of you, like we're focused a little bit on like somebody has died in the past. I'm wondering, um, if I could pick your brains on anticipatory loss and parenting. So, for example, like in my field where I run up against kids there is a serious illness.
Mhm.
It is known. So often it can be a parent that is dying of whatever the situation is. And there again, because what brought this to mind was that idea of shielding and of processing. And I've been specifically asked early on in that serious illness, like when death is known, but the timing is not, when to tell kids that this is because, and it's very reasonable, the parents say to me, this is an adult problem. We don't want to overburden the kids, like, because it's very intimate, like it is their parent that is dying. We don't want to have them hold that grief for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. Could I hear anything from you? Because I hear this from a lot of parents. So on behalf of them, how do we talk about grief ahead of death? And what is the importance of having that conversation when death is on the horizon but not yet?
Mhm.
I'll throw it out there. Either one of you can jump in, or you can say no.
No, I'll start with a couple thoughts on that, Sarah. I think the first part of it is just, again, like that reframing about that grief is still there, right? That there's grief related to death loss, of course, but that grief has been there and will always be there. And so part of like our responsibility as caretakers of children is engaging in those conversations, like Sue said, when maybe the loss isn't super present, but the loss may be close. And so giving them some of that language, that some of the things they might be feeling now could in fact be grief, of just that feeling of like not being able to connect with that person in the same way that they were before, or just noticing changes in the person in terms of like how they would relate to each other, or how they spend time with each other, and just being able to connect those dots around like, oh, you're missing some of those, missing this person, or you're missing what you used to do with them, and how that all cycles back to grief and that preparing for someone to not physically be here anymore. Um, so that's one of the first things come to mind, is just normalizing it, that grief is throughout the whole process. And that the thing about kids, sometimes we get worried about this, is that, and Sue spoke to this as well, we call it puddle jumping. Kids are in and out. So you can include them and involve them in the conversation. That doesn't mean they're going to stay there for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the road. They're going to touch in, they're going to touch out, they're going to ask you questions, they're going to go away, play, process, come back, maybe ask you some more, share some insights, but they're not living grief in themselves all day, every day, all the time, the way that sometimes we as adults do.
That's right.
And so there can be that reassurance to say, like, include them in the conversation, but don't expect that they're then going to be in that down space. If they do react that way, they're not going to live in that space through that whole time. Yeah.
No, definitely not. I go back to, including them, again, developmentally where it's appropriate to do so, answering questions, letting them know what's going to be happening. It's often, when people say, well, I didn't know, fill in blank, that was going to happen. And if you have prior knowledge of what it's going to look like or who will be present, etc., and leaving space around kids to change their mind. You originally said you didn't want to be there, and now you do want to be there. So letting them know that, changing your mind is very acceptable and understandable, and doing what they feel is best for themselves at the time. And we often fear, I think, that our emotion will be too much for children, and oftentimes they are the comforters. I wanted to go back to about, I don't know what to say. And so, if you can teach kids at an early age how to hold space is one of the hardest things to do, because you're not cheering up, you're not fixing, you're witnessing, you're not looking away, you're staying present. And kids do it so naturally, that, they're already there, they're already able to do that. um, I just have had so many children tell me how glad they were to be present at the end. That they felt, and other children would have said that they felt excluded. And again, going back to, children should not be left alone in this. They should be included.
I have a tip on that, Sue, that comes to my mind, and it's true for a lot of events with children, like weddings included. Um, is that idea of having a shepherd for your kid that's
Mhm.
not somebody that is in the event. So
Yes.
so for example, at hospice, when a young person who was in elementary school, her parent was passing away, the family had assigned a role, like that little person had a person, so
Nice.
that little girl could come into the room, be a part of the gathering, but when she wanted to step out, that person could step away, but it didn't have to be the dad
Hmm.
because he needed to stand. But it was a trusted person. So one tip that I would have for parents is think through who's in your who are the people in your community that person could be their. So then that person could put their whole mind to making sure this kid has the right nutrition and
Hmm.
comfort and nap and clothing and whatever their needs are, so that they can come in and out and in and out without interrupting, like so that those who are in that immediate circle can also have what they need in that time, have their person
Yes.
taken care of. So that would
I,
be
I
one
rec-
tip that I would have for that.
yeah, I recommend that as well. People are usually very instrumental in their grief in that they want to do something to help. And
Yeah.
so people are I have found very receptive to being in the helper role. Oh, absolutely. I can get the meals. I can take her to the playground. I can do all those things. And so, yeah, I often will recommend that to families and to to folks who are experiencing the fullness of the grief themselves. It's hard to look
Especially
after someone else.
like hospitals or ICU units, that can be scary
Yes.
and Lyndon, maybe you have an eye to that too, like with your role there of the environment. Hospice, has that emphasis of fairly peaceful and low key, but that's not every environment. So to be able to have that kid feel safe and supported, so if they want to touch in, but as soon as,
Mhm.
to have that other viewpoint.
Yeah. There was something you said earlier, Sarah, that just as you talked at the beginning too, around like strategies and tips that connects to all of this. So I think about for parents and caregivers who are really doing that work around preparing how to have these conversations and like engage all those different support people in their life and doing that preparation. But for folks who want a takeaway tool, the ones that come to mind that I never hesitate to bring up anytime I'm talking about kids' grief, they call it the C's around grief. And so they're kind of these core questions. You can find these great PDF overview online. I think Sick Kids has a great one that's printable. And so it's the 6 C's around children's grief. And so if you're wondering about how to initiate these conversations or what maybe your child could be thinking about as you prepare for someone's death, so you've anticipated, you know that somebody is going to die in terms of serious illness. So the 6 C's, and there is some variation in them, but the core ones are: did I cause it? So cause, so making sure the child knows that you know they did not cause it. Can I control it? Is there anything that they can do to control the outcome or the progression of the disease? Can I cure it? Is another one. Is there anything I can do to stop this death or this illness from happening? Um, uh, who's going to take care of me, especially if it's relating to a parent or a caregiver? How do I stay connected? So, how do I continue that bond going forward? And there is always one that I forget: uh, cause, cure, connect, control, care. Oh, catch. Can I catch it? So, is there any way that I can die, or can I get this illness in the way that they are? And so, I always kind of say to
Or
folks,
maybe their other parent too, like,
yes.
are you next, for,
Mhm.
Yes,
uh,
exactly. So any of those kind of daunting questions that people have, I'd often say, like when you think about your worst case scenario question around like, I don't want to have that question. So I always kind of shudder whenever I think about a child asking me that, Sarah, like, okay,
Mhm.
mom, dad, does that mean dad's going to die? So if I can regulate myself first and then think about within the 6 C's, what does that question truly connect to? It's because they're
Mhm.
wondering, who's going to take care of me? Is there anything I can do to control this? Am I going to catch it? And so when you kind of break it down in these more manageable chunks and questions that people can usually have a bit more confidence answering, like I can confidently answer some of those, whereas I maybe couldn't confidently answer the piece around, is dad gonna die?
Mhm.
So that's a great tool for anybody working with kids,
Mhm.
especially in advance, talking to them about serious illness. Yeah.
And maybe I'll throw this out in a general way about either do you have in your, because I know that both of you have like this massive sort of toolbox of what you would suggest for kids. Do you have anything in mind that whether it's a legacy or connection activity that kids can do, a way that they could participate in funerals or memorials? I'll just put it out as a general. Do you have any activities that you love to do with kids, or you see helping with the with children, or resources that you think would be helpful? It'll be a general question. So,
Sure. Well, I'm not an art therapist, but I use art therapy techniques.
mm,
And what I have found is that all art is therapeutic.
mm,
And so it's sort of like talking without telling. You're revealing how you feel about something internally with maybe the language doesn't exist to express it. I had a little one very reluctant to come to counseling, and he stood in the doorway and kind of eyeballed me for a bit. And then he decided he'd come in. And so I was laying on the floor doing this big art project, and he joined me. And at the end, I said, "Do you think you'd consider coming back?" And he said, "Yeah, I will come back, Sue Smiley. And you know why?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you've got that pile of rocks and sticks over there." And I don't, strategically place rocks and sticks. I just happen to like rocks and sticks. And so did he. And so it was this point of connection. So oftentimes I will invite kids to come up with the activity. And there was a child who recently drowned, a very tragic flash flood situation. And the kids that knew him and were in his grade, they came up with the idea around painting the rocks and around his house and expressing themselves that way. I sit on the board of a new to Nova Scotia organization called Bernie's Buddies.ca, and they're Angela Linkhorn is the creator, the executive director, and she lived in Calgary for many years. And thankfully, she's come home. And so Bernie's Buddies provide support to grieving children in the form of workshops with therapy dogs, a yoga session on breathing, always an art activity. Uh, Sometimes it involves filling up water-filled balloons and throwing them to express feelings. Sometimes it's making memory jars that are tissue paper sort of on the outside of recycled pickle jars with a little light inside. What I love about something like a little candle or a light is you're creating intentional time and space to think about that person. Like it's intentional and it's valued and everyone around supports you. And you don't have to be hijacked by your grief because you've made room for it. And I've seen so many adults try to outrun their grief only to have it hijack them in the middle of a grocery store or somewhere where they would prefer not to have that happen. But kids are so open to learning about, grounding techniques and breathing and expression. As you were saying, Lyndon, they live in the world of magical thinking. So the creativity is there. When I would do art therapy with adults, sometimes there'd be a lot of resistance because they'd have this big inner critic that says, "Oh no, the house is not supposed to be smaller than the dog." And, whereas kids are so free, like, yeah, the monkey's purple, that's the color, and so you're using their natural um, being, how they are existing in the world to access that. But I'm always doing an activity with a child. I never sit across from them and make eye contact and ask them about their inner world.
but as you're saying that, Sue, so many things come to mind. But part of it is that even with teenagers now, like that's when you go for a drive, that's
Mhm.
that's when they're able to fully, like when you were like, now we're going to talk, it's that side by each. I remember another chaplain when I was first working with kids and grief. He said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Like, people call you into these situations expecting you to be like this grand, speaker. When the kid just wants to play checkers, and if you
Yeah.
allow yourself to play checkers with this kid, they will share the wholeness of their soul with you, as you're doing that. But so I really appreciate those very concrete things. And even as you were saying about that lighting the candle, that intentionality, like this is a moment. Also, if you had that as a pattern in your family, like when this candle is lit, this is a moment too. Or even when you said earlier about that couch, like meet me in the middle, like I
Mhm.
wonder if you could set up in your house, this is a spot that would invite invitations. So if you're
Mhm.
in this couch, that means like you have something, and often it's in the evening and often it's at bedtime, but like that you could be like, so
Yeah.
if kids know if something's chewing on them, they know they'll have opportunity when this moment happens, or sort of put
With
that
kids,
in.
I use those little battery operated tea lights that you can turn on and off, and so there's no risk of any injury that way. But yeah, just to give them all the resources. And when I do art, I don't just have all the pretty colors. I have
Mhm.
all the colors. I have zippers. I have jagged fabric. Because again, if we just show all the pretty stuff, we're not inviting them to show anything other than happy. And so I want them to be able to express the fullness of whatever they feel. And sometimes that's
And
scribbling
sometimes
in a scrapbook. Like this
like
is
the art
my,
can look scary, like like
yeah,
some of these kids, like
yeah,
the
it's
the
not meant to
eyes
be
are
put on the
red and
fridge.
they're
Yeah,
just like,
this
oh,
is,
tell me about that.
yeah, I call it throwing up on the page, which kids like because it sounds gross. But yeah, just scribbling out your feelings. The texture and the colors and you can just see the energy of that scribble. The abstractness of it, the roller coaster. It's not linear because grief isn't linear. So yeah, it's just the fullness of however they want to express themselves.
Mhm. I think about how you can build that as well, like those approaches to kind of like ongoing connections with people in their lives who have died too. So think about all the times that you are getting kids to draw a picture for so and so, or can you make a birthday card for so and so, or we'll bake some cookies for so and so, right? We're engaging in these
Mhm.
kind of acts of service or these acts of connection for people in their community and in their life. And so doing that if someone is seriously ill and they're going to die, continuing those and giving those opportunities as well as like another
Mm,
great connection point. And then after someone has died, you can still do those things. People can still draw
yeah,
pictures for a granddad who's died. You can still maybe make your friend's favorite, I don't know, pizza
mhm,
recipe. Like there are things you can do that still sustain that and maybe stem from those really early moments where you were already naturally engaged in. They don't have to be these grand different things, kind of what you've
yeah,
touched on, Sue and Sarah. It doesn't have to be these
yeah.
innovative things. It can be the same things that kids like to do, but you're doing it with a different intention, or there might be a different focus on it.
I
In
think
this
that culture
culture,
has
we've
like puddle jumping too. So
Yes.
like giving permissions for the many times in like long-term grief with a kid, inviting like a picture to be out at, the grade six graduation, inviting a fabric to be present at, the grade 12. So those moments where kids are coming back to their grief and coming back to their grief, but
yes.
maintaining that dad is still a presence in our lives. Yeah.
Absolutely. In this culture, we have the say goodbye metaphor. You got to say goodbye. Have you said goodbye? Why don't you say goodbye? I find it interesting cross culturally in Australia, they have the say hello metaphor. So say hello to the new normal. Say hello to keeping that door ajar because
Mhm.
closure doesn't exist, not in the way that some people would like it to exist. And all closure does is stop the conversation.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned earlier, Lyndon, I think possibly in your introduction, it's ongoing. We grow around the grief. We don't ever end it. I think in my own life, being widowed at 27, I can access my first husband with more joy and less sorrow, but always thought of. And what you were saying, Sarah, about the fabric. When my daughter had major milestones in her life, I wore both our wedding bands. So when she graduated from high school, when I held our first grandchild, to say just because this person physically doesn't exist anymore. The other thing is, kids want to know the whole person. So when Haley was little, at bedtime especially, she would say, "Tell me stories about my dad." But what she really wanted to know was, "Tell me the stories that kind of made you crazy, like how he bugged you, how he got under your skin," because that was a real person. Because the potential to elevate someone to sainthood after death is so very tempting.
Mhm.
But how could you relate to that person? You want to know that they were stubborn. You want to know that they, did crazy things when they were a teenager or whatever. So, and kids love those stories. They prefer those stories because they can relate to them. But yeah, I love the idea of continuing with the things that we can touch and feel and smell
Mhm.
and bringing that person along with us. I'll say things like my grandmother, I'll do or say something and I'm like, there's that, DNA showing up again. And I love that because she is not gone. She is physically gone. But yeah, we have this thing where the person should never be spoken of again. And so unhealthy, so unhealthy. I do think that's changing as our views around grief become more evolved. I've certainly seen a huge change from when I started this work 30 years ago to now. It used to be so taboo.
Oh, I
And
agree. And with kids being now,
included.
I would say at funerals, I have a whole other rant, and I won't get into it about how oftentimes we're not doing funerals. We're not doing whatever name you want to call it, celebration of life memorials. There's been a large disruption on that for multiple of reasons. I have a rant about that. I won't share it, but about inviting kids into that. Before we end our conversation, because we have to at some point, do you have any, what would be your top couple of resources or things, like if you had a friend that was grieving that you would point them towards? You've already mentioned Sue, the Bernie's Buddies. That's a very Googleable
Yes.
title. I mentioned the Grief Library as being resources free all across Nova Scotia for free borrowing. So Lyndon, I'll turn it over to you first. Do you have a couple of things like if parents, caregivers, grandparents right now are saying, okay, this has whetted my appetite, I'd like some more, what would you point them towards first? Do you have some things that you would like to share?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the tops, I have to always edit. So this is where I want to share all the resources all the time. So I'll say that folks, as my role, please reach out to me. And like I serve Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI. So folks are welcome to reach out to me if they're looking for resources. I
How do they get a
receive
hold of you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I receive in community inquiries all the time. So you can find me at the IWK Bereavement Coordinator. If you just go on, again, IWK website and search bereavement services, I'm the only one. So you can find me that way or call the switchboard. But some of my top resources right now. So I will share that the Roger Nielsen Hospice in Ontario, which is a fantastic organization, they have a Caring for Young Grievers webinar and they run it. They alternate. They do it 1 month for professionals and 1 month for parents and caregivers. And it's just 1 hour and supporting young grievers. And so it's a great way where you're going to tackle some of the content that Sue and I already covered today, but it is very much for that lens around how do I support children during grief. And they do adopt that lens around taking care of the parent and caregiver as well. The other really concrete one that I appreciate, like we talked about, not being prepared to answer those questions. How do I answer some of those big questions? AWC Grief Support on YouTube. So that's, again, another Ontario-based organization, but they've got great 2 to 3 minute video clips of how to explain cremation to a child. How do you include kids in a funeral? How do you explain suicide? How do you explain all of these kind of bigger ideas in these really beautiful, concrete ways? And then the last one is just to say this latest grief storybook that I read and loved. And if you don't already have it at the library, Sarah, please, it's called The Bear-Shaped Hole. It's by Doherty and illustrated by Doherty. Oh, Sue's nodding. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it gutted me in a beautiful way. But even just the illustration of it and the idea of just the continuing bonds and relationship. And so just that's my latest favorite storybook if you're trying to engage children.
Yeah.
And for myself as a person reading it, I got a therapeutic benefit from reading it because it was quite beautiful. So those are my top 3 right now.
I just recently gifted our local library with that book because I found that they didn't have hardly any books for grieving children. So yeah, I love that book so much. Bereaved Families of Nova Scotia was an organization that seemed to be very Cape Breton centric, but is now moving throughout Nova Scotia. And in fact, there's a session tonight, but as you say, Sarah, this is time sensitive. So when this airs, the session will be over. But if you just Google Bereaved Families of Nova Scotia, they have tons of support. I mentioned in my intro, SueSmiley.com, Sue Smiley, all one word, which kids believe is all one word. They say, hi, Sue Smiley, bye, Sue Smiley. So contact me anytime. The only request I have, if anyone ever emails me, is do not start a conversation with me with, I hope I'm not bothering you. You will never be bothering me. I am inviting you to do this. So do not take or apologize for taking up space in the world. Just go for it. And if I can help provide additional resources very specific to your needs, then I want to do that. And we already mentioned about Bernie's Buddies. I really like the Dougie Center for Children. It started in California, but the support is very global. And again, if you just Google the Dougie Center, lots of concrete, takeaways, strategies, etc., that you can go through and see what would be appropriate. And again, I really, really invite everyone, every parent, to consider this when there has not been a loss, so that you have the emotional to be able to engage with your child and invite them to engage. So not if it happens, when it happens, you'll feel a little bit more prepared to have these conversations. But there is no expert. Well, the only expert is the child. But as far as we go, we're just learning, and continue to position yourself as a student. It's a really great place to be.
And at the one other place that comes to mind too is Camp Brigadoon, which is a camp that has camps throughout the summer for often medically related issues for kids. There is a camp with Brigadoon specifically for grief and loss called Camp Solace. And so if a child has experienced that very deep grief, that could be a place where they can feel have that grief talk through while still being in a camp setting. Is quite magical. And I know they're putting some family programs as well involved for them. So that would be a look at their socials as well for another Nova Scotia based place. Okay. Unless anybody has something they're just chewing on their teeth to say.
Oh, I do. I was going to say one as like a wrap up point, because I find that whenever we talk about parenting and grief, we'll start about talking about the parents and caregivers, and then we always shift into supporting kids, right? And that's really natural, because that's also the first question, and the main question is that whenever I'm working with bereaved parents, they're wondering about how do I support the kids, and that they're going to put that need first. And just to say that all the research and everything out there says that if you can build up support for the parents in terms of caregiving for kids, it has a benefit for the whole. So I know that we floated back and forth, but just to say that is one of the biggest pieces. And by providing support for kids, you're providing support for parents and caregivers too. So it is all encompassing. Yeah.
No, I think that's really key that you said that, because instantly that if you are whole, you
Yes.
have space to hold. If your arms are available, then you can hold a child. But if not, you just don't have that place. So, Lyndon, I appreciate that was your closing idea. That remember that you are also a beloved child. And that you are also worthy of care in this moment, and maybe need to be parented a little bit yourself.
Absolutely.
Sue, do you have anything that you want to close in for a goodbye before we say our farewell?
Just that I'm so honored to do this work and to companion people through this time of change and transformation. It's the work is not depressing. It is inspiring, and I'm always in awe of the courage of people that are willing to be messy in the fullness of their grief.
Yeah. That's a beautiful way to close. I agree. And often when people come into hospice, they say to us, "Oh, you're all angel. Like how can you do this work every day?" And it is because we do live in grief, but the underbelly of that is love. So more often than not, it's witnessing that deepest human goodness, and so it is not exhausting. So thank you, both of you, for sharing of your heart. And I'm so glad that we were able to have this time together. May the words that have been spoken and the resources offered find their place out there in the internet for the people who are listening. Know that you are loved and cared for. Even though in some ways you're an anonymous person, we are very aware almost that you're at this table. And so know that you're loved, and that invitation, as Sue said, is very present to connect in and to respond in any way that you feel led to. So thank you both for today. We'll say our goodbyes, and just deep appreciation to you both.
Thank you.